This video is for educational purposes. Any pictures used or sources cited are for that purpose. Hey there, it's Discerning Dad 73, otherwise known as Nate, and in this third video in my series on angels and giants, we will consider many more scripture references to giants in the Bible. In fact, most people have no idea how much the Old Testament has to say about the giants who lived on the earth. Goliath, whom David killed, was only one of the many giants that we find in Scripture, and many times people think he was the only giant in Scripture. In my last video, part 2 of this series entitled Offspring of Angels, Nephilim Giants, we briefly recapped items from video 1, Angels Who Sinned. We also dove deeper into Genesis 6:4, examining the term Nephilim or giant and the term mighty men. We considered Numbers 13, 25 through 33, which sheds more light on the Genesis 6 situation in terms of the giant tribes that were in the land of Canaan and were part of that conquest after the spies spied out the land. We also consulted Amos 2:9, which gives a great description of not only the height of some of these giant people, but also terms denoting their great strength. And lastly, we reviewed much testimony from history concerning the race of giants found in the Bible. If you've not watched my first 2 videos in this series, please consider doing so. I'll put the links to the first 2 vids in the description. Now let's quickly look again at the foundational passage for this video series, Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. Now this term mighty, found in Genesis 6 verse 4, that I also shared about in an earlier video, means warrior, tyrant, giant. Many believe that Nimrod, spoken of in Genesis 10, verses 8 through 9, was not just a mighty warrior in general, but was also of the race of the Nephilim giants. The Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh has long been thought to be connected to Nimrod. In this thinking, Gilgamesh is Nimrod. Consider some ancient artwork depicting Gilgamesh holding and subduing a lion. Now look at the scale of the lion versus the statue of Gilgamesh. By the looks of it, Nimrod was about 12 feet tall, putting him in the category of Og of Bashan's size perhaps. In Genesis 14, 5 through 6, we see that King Chedorlaomer of Elam and his forces or allies killed the Rephaims, the giants, as well as the Zumims and Emims and Horites, who are also called giants in other Old Testament books, such as Deuteronomy. In Genesis 4 verse 7, it shares that upon their return, they also killed all the Amalekites and Amorites, who were called Nephilim giants as well in Numbers chapter 13, verses 27 through 33. Deuteronomy 2, 10 through 12 references the tribes spoken of in Genesis 14, 5 through 6 as giants. Deuteronomy 3, 10 through 11 tells us that the king Og of Bashan at this time was the only one who remained of the Rephaim giants. These were one of the groups of giants mentioned as well in Genesis 14, 5 through 6. Now consider the material used to construct his bed, a bed of iron, and look at the size of his bed. It was about 14 to 16 feet long by 5 to 7 feet wide, depending on which ancient cubit you use, and of course the size of a man's cubit. Even if you use the standard Egyptian cubit, Og must have been at least 12 feet tall and likely weighed 800 to 1,000 pounds. No wonder he needed a bed made of iron. Are you starting to get a much bigger picture of what the Bible actually contains regarding the Nephilim giants? Pun intended. The offspring of the union between the angels, or sons of God, that came down to the earth and mated with human women, Genesis 6. Even just considering the account of all the giants from Numbers 13 alone, as we did in our last video, is more than enough evidence to show how much Nephilim activity in the Bible there is, and more than most people have ever realized. But all the giants I have shared thus far are not the end of giant accounts in the Bible. Let's continue, shall we? Deuteronomy 9, 1 through 2. Moses gave Israel a huge pep talk before they went over Jordan into the land of Canaan. He reminded them of the giants, nations that were, quote, greater and, quote, mightier than them, with fortified cities that were very high, a people great and tall, the descendants of the Anakims. And he says, who can stand before the children of Anak? Joshua chapter 15, verse 8, mentions in the allotment of land for the tribe of Judah, it speaks of the valley of the giants. In other words, an entire valley was known for the giant nations that dwelled therein. Let's talk about Goliath, who's probably the most famous giant in the Bible, in 1 Samuel chapter 17, 3 through 4. For some strange reason, many people believe that Goliath was perhaps the only giant in Scripture. The funny thing is that Goliath, although certainly a giant, 9 to 10 feet tall, and of massive strength, was not the biggest that ever lived. He actually was on the smaller end of the Old Testament giants that were mentioned. Remember again, Amos chapter 2, verse 9, the Amorites were said to be the height of the cedar trees. And, of course, the average cedar tree at the time was about 36 feet tall. The cedars of Lebanon got up to 150 feet tall. So even if you're looking at the lower end of that, somewhere around 30 feet, Goliath certainly is not the biggest giant that ever lived. 1 Samuel 7, 5 through 6 tells us something interesting, that the coat of mail armor that Goliath wore into battle weighed 5,000 shekels of brass, or over 100 pounds. Some believe up to 125 pounds. Not to mention his helmet, the armor that was on his legs and between his shoulders. How mighty a person do you have to be able to be to fight wearing almost 200 pounds of armor in total? Most strong men of today could barely just move around in that. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 7 also speaks about the staff of his spear, which was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head, which weighed 600 shekels of iron. Now, if you do the math on that, the spearhead weighed about 12.5 pounds, just the head of the spear alone. The spear was like a weaver's beam, or the staff of his spear. And in the research that I did, some believe that the weaver's beam was about 2.5 inches in diameter. And normally a spear would be about the length of the height of whoever was wielding it. So you're looking at a spear which staff is about 9 feet tall, maybe 10 feet tall, 2.5 inches in diameter, with a 12 to 13 pound spear head. So that spear could have weighed up to 20 pounds just by itself. How mighty of a person would you have to be to really wield that effectively? 2 Samuel 21, verses 16 through the first part of 17, mentions Ishbi-Benob. Wow, quite a name. I imagine most people, because of his size, would not have been making fun of him, but it says he was of the sons of the giant, the weight of whose spear weighed 300 shekels of brass in weight. It says he was girded with the sword and thought to have slain David, but Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, smote the Philistine and killed him. Then in 2 Samuel 21, verses 18 through 19, you have another giant Philistine named Seth, who was killed in battle. And it says that he was killed, and he was the brother of Goliath. Again, the staff of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. So these guys were not small, and they were not even just large humans. They were, in fact, giants. 2 Samuel 21, verses 20 through 21, says that there was a man of great stature in Gath, also born of the giant. He had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. 6 fingers, 6 toes. Does that remind you of anything? There was a giant in Europe on display for many years after the turn of the century who was 12 feet tall that had 6 fingers and 6 toes on each hand and foot. Also, notice Hollywood's nod to the Nephilim, the Princess Bride movie, which is basically a cult classic. Remember the 6-fingered man that Inigo Montoya wanted to kill and avenge the death of his father. So even Hollywood gives its nod to the Nephilim. 1 Chronicles 20, verse 8 gives some similar information as the passages in 2 Samuel that we read. But it says about these men, these giants, it says, "These were born unto the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants." And it says that these were the brothers of Goliath. So Goliath certainly was not the only giant of the Philistines. He was just one of the giants that were born to a giant in Gath. And they were just a handful of giants compared to all of the other giant references that we find in Scripture. Now let's also consider some information from 1 Enoch chapter 15, 1 through 11. And I'm not going to read all 11 verses, but I want to share a couple of highlights from this. If you have a book of 1 Enoch, you can look it up, or you can just Google it, and you can look at the whole reference there. But in verse 3, it says, "Wherefore have ye left the high, holy, and eternal heaven, and lain with women, and defiled yourselves with the daughters of men, and taken to yourselves wives, and done like the children of earth, and begotten giants as your sons?" Verse 8, "And now the giants who are produced from the spirits and flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and the earth shall be their dwelling." And more as I study the demons, I believe that the demons are not evil angels, but the demons are actually these disembodied Nephilim or giant spirits who Enoch called evil spirits. Verse 11, "And the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth, and cause trouble. They take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst, and cause offenses. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of men and against the women, because they have proceeded from them." So wow, that certainly paints a nasty picture there of the effect of these giants. Also consider 1 Enoch chapter 7, 3 through 6. And I'll go ahead and actually read several verses here from Enoch 7. "And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one. And they began to go in unto them, and to defile themselves with them." This is speaking of the watchers or angels that came. "And they taught them charms and enchantments, and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants, and they became pregnant. And they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish." And so they even sinned against the animals. And there's some different theories on what exactly took place there. Some believe they were having sexual relations with certain animals. Some believe they were using some type of hybridization type of situation. But notice also, it says that they began to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. Again, this is from Enoch 7, 1 through 6, but specifically 3 through 6. Well, giants, giants, and more giants. Here's a couple of very interesting pictures, supposedly of the footprints of giants. And look at just the scale of that. Certainly, you're talking much larger than even Goliath's stature. Here is a picture about the skeletal remains that were documented in historical records and some of the various sizes and heights. And that certainly would fit with the biblical account. 36 feet tall on the right would fit with the account from Amos 2, verse 9, about them being the heights of the cedars. Here's a picture of a giant, I'm assuming from a movie, but notice something that's very interesting when you compare these last two pictures. Notice how the giant in the movie there is really imitating recorded reality. If you take that giant there on the right as being around 25 feet on the scale picture to the left, and the person that he's holding at about 6 feet or so, that certainly could be plausible. So interesting how so many of the movies and things today imitate reality, although they're touted as just being fantasy or just being make-believe or just being for fun in the movies. But they're throwing it in our faces. It's right out in plain sight, hidden in plain sight, as they often like to do. Well, I hope that you will join me for my next video upload, because this wraps up the video here on giants, giants, and more giants in the Bible. My next video about angels and giants, video number 5, will be entitled A Giant Conspiracy. Giant bones, giant stories, and a giant cover-up. I hope you'll tune in for that. I know that's going to be another great topic for discussion. Well, thanks again so much for watching. I hope that you'll subscribe, like, and share. If you need to get a hold of me, you can contact me at discerningdad73@gmail.com. And may you seek truth and discern between good and evil each day. Take care and God bless.